Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. What this means is that, generally speaking, I'm the guy that you can come to with any question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, or any of his other works, or even about the man himself. I've been studying Tolkien for decades now. And I just turned 44 just a few weeks ago, and it's just like, wow, I'm thinking about it. I first discovered the work of J.R.R. Tolkien when I was a very young boy. Perhaps I'll tell the story in detail at some point, or I might have in a previous video, maybe even in like the very first video. But I might make a video just for something like that if you guys are interested in that sort of thing. Let me know, just like my sort of Tolkien journey. And it's just, it really has been decades, and it just often doesn't feel that long, I always say Tolkien fan since the 80s. That's what it says on my Quora. And Quora is where you can ask me questions. Of course, you can go ahead right there in the comments and ask questions there, and I will answer them to the best of my ability. But if you want to be featured in a video, you go to Quora, and there's a link to my Quora in the description, and also to my Quora space, The Grey Havens, where all of my answers are posted, as well as answers from other creators that I either know or I just enjoy their work and have invited them in and such like that. So, very quick channel update. We're now at 1,981 subscribers, so we're really right there at the goal line for 2,000 subs here, which is really, really amazing. I remember the long push for 1,000, and it just strikes me how much shorter the push for 2,000 is, and it's just absolutely amazing. And I thank everyone that has subscribed, and everyone that will subscribe. I preemptively thank you, and I'm going to ask for you to subscribe because we're really trying to hit 2,000. I'm also going to ask at the end of the video, because if you reach the end of the video, maybe you're on the fence right now. Maybe you're like, well, this guy seems all right, but do I really want to see more of him? Do I really want to be notified once to twice a week of him uploading videos of talking about J.R.R. Tolkien's works? I don't know if I want that. But the videos are generally about an hour long. So if we get to the end of it, you've watched a whole hour, then I'm going to ask you to subscribe again. And then you pretty much have to at that point, right? I think it's required. It's in the bylaws. Yeah, so, I'm being a little silly here, but of course there's also memberships. Consider membership. Membership is a paid subscription. It does let you see the videos early. It does give you a few other perks, and those perks are going to become a lot better once we hit 2,000, because I'm going to start doing occasional streams on YouTube here. I'm also going to be streaming on Twitch as I normally do, about twice a month on Tolkien topics, 2 to 3 times a month actually, but they will be simultaneously broadcast to YouTube as well. And so the members who have emotes, like the Eye of Sauron and the Silmaril, and there's like a few of them. There's an Eye of Sauron, there's a Silmaril. I know you get a G rune, the Gandalf rune, but that's like your membership badge. I forget what else did I make. I think there was the One Ring. The One Ring is in there as well, and I'll probably make more as we get more members and such. But it's also just a way to support me if that's your sort of thing. Some people have told me that the join button sometimes just doesn't work. They try to click on it and nothing happens. If you are trying to hit that join button and it just doesn't work, all you got to do, like I said, everything's in the description. Everything is in there. It should be the very first thing in the description that says join the channel as a member, and that link will work. We tested this out with somebody who was contacting me, who was saying the join button doesn't work. I'm trying to join. It's not working. And I said, I don't really know what to tell you. Maybe if I put a link directly to it in the description, it might work. And then it worked. So I don't know why. It must be a glitch on YouTube's end, and unfortunately there's nothing I can do about it. I'm not in charge of making sure their links work, but the link is in the description. There's a lot of things in the description that you should check out. Also, all of my videos have chapters. If you put your mouse over the timeline, you can see what each question is and such. If you want to just get to specific things, you can. Now, I don't have as many questions this week as I normally do. We normally do like around 15 to 20 questions. Last week, I think I had 11 or 12. This week I only have 10. And what's interesting is it's just because I've been busy, because it was the holidays. I'm recording this on New Year's Eve. As a matter of fact, by the time I do the end of this, it's going to be January 1st because it is nearly midnight. But anyway, the reason I bring this up is because I've lost my train of thought completely, and that has been known to happen. But that is okay. We will get that train of thought back. I'm recording this on the 31st. It's New Year's Eve. Oh, the reason I don't have as many questions is the holidays have been quite hectic for me. So, running around and family obligations and such. So I haven't had as much time. Last week, which I was recording on Christmas Eve, which was wild to do that. I just sort of snuck it in there. I was saying, we're going to kind of do like a shorter video. There's only like 11 questions. But then the end result was that the video was still over an hour long, just a little bit over an hour long. And I'm thinking, man, I've done videos where I've done like 18, 19 questions, and it was like 50 minutes. This was like an hour and 5. And I got to thinking, it's because when I don't have as much to get through, I talk longer. And that's really what it comes down to. I feel more comfortable talking longer. It's like we only have 10. So I'm going to ask you guys a question, and let me know in the comments what you think. Would you prefer for there to be less questions, like 10 or so in a video, but going into more detail and musing more and such? Or would you prefer more questions are covered but with less time dedicated to each question to just sort of be a little more perfunctory? Or do you prefer sort of a mix of both where, I guess the happy medium would be like 15 questions where some are long and some are short, as opposed to, 10 long answers or 20 shorter ones. So let me know what you think, your thoughts on it. I'm not necessarily going to go by what any one particular person says, so keep that in mind. But I'm just sort of gauging my options here. Anyway, we're going to get to a reading, and I just grabbed a book at random, and it turned out to be The Hobbit. So the part that I want to read, is it Queer Lodgings? Or is it... It is, I think. This is shortly after they came out of the Misty Mountains. Bilbo now has the One Ring, and they're being chased, though, by goblins and wargs, and they wind up climbing up some trees, and Gandalf tries to fight them off with fire. The wargs are very afraid of fire, but then the goblins show up, and they're not very afraid of fire. And they're rescued by the Eagles of Manwë. The Eagles come, and they bring them to the Eyrie, and they speak with Gwei here, and they are taken to a place called the Carrick, and then they go to Beorn's house, and there's a part here where Gandalf sort of introduces everyone to Beorn, but he does it in a very specific way, to go with Bilbo alone first, and then to slowly have more and more of the dwarves show up as he's telling the story of how he came to be there, and Beorn getting invested in the story and interested in it, because he's a very gruff man and doesn't really take kindly to visitors. And I have a commentary on this that I want to get into here, but here we are. After a while they came to a belt of tall and very ancient oaks, and beyond these to a high thorn hedge through which you could neither see nor scramble. "You had better wait here," said the wizard to the dwarves, "and when I call or whistle, begin to come after me. You will see the way I go, but only in pairs, mind, about 5 minutes between each pair of you. Bomber is fattest and will do for 2, and he had better come alone and last. Come on, Mr. Baggins. There is a gate somewhere round this way." And with that he went off along the hedge, taking the frightened hobbit with him. They soon came to a wooden gate, high and broad, beyond which they could see gardens and a cluster of low wooden bridges, some thatched and made of unshapen logs, barns, stables, sheds, and a long, low wooden house. Inside, on the southward side of the great hedge, were rows and rows of hives with bell-shaped tops made of straw. The noise of the giant bees flying to and fro, crawling in and out, filled all the air. The wizard and the hobbit pushed open the heavy creaking gate and went down to a wide track toward the house. Some horses, very sleek and well-groomed, trotted up across the grass and looked at them intently with very intelligent faces. Then off they galloped to the buildings. "They have gone to tell him of the arrival of strangers," said Gandalf. Soon they reached a courtyard, 3 walls of which were formed by the wooden house and its 2 long wings. In the middle there was lying a great oak trunk with many lopped branches beside it. Standing near was a huge man with a thick black beard and hair, and great bare arms and legs with knotted muscles. He was clothed in a tunic of wool down to his knees, and was leaning on a large axe. The horses were standing by him with their noses at his shoulder. "Here they are," he said to the horses. "They don't look dangerous. You can be off." He laughed a great rolling laugh, put down his axe, and came forward. "Who are you, and what do you want?" he asked gruffly, standing in front of them and towering tall above Gandalf. As for Bilbo, he could easily have trotted through his legs without ducking his head to miss the fringe of the man's brown tunic. "I am Gandalf," said the wizard. "Never heard of him," growled the man. "And what's this little fellow?" he said, stooping down to frown at the hobbit with his bushy black eyebrows. "That is Mr. Baggins, a hobbit of good family and unimpeachable reputation," said Gandalf. Bilbo bowed. He had no hat to take off and was painfully conscious of his many missing buttons. "I am a wizard," continued Gandalf. "I have heard of you, and if you have not heard of me, but perhaps you have heard of my good cousin Radagast, who lives near the southern borders of Mirkwood." "Yes, not a bad fellow as wizards go, I believe. I used to see him now and again," said Bjorn. "Well, now I know who you are, or what you say you are. What do you want?" "To tell the truth, we have lost our luggage and nearly lost our way, and are rather in need of help, or at least of advice. I may say we have rather a bad time with goblins in the mountains." "Goblins," said the big man, less gruffly. "Oh, so you've been having trouble with them, have you? What did you go near them for?" "We did not mean to. They surprised us at night, in a pass which we had to cross. We were coming out of the lands of the west into these countries. It is a long tale." "Then you had better come inside and tell me some of it, if it won't take all day," said the man, leading the way through a dark door that opened out of the courtyard into the house. Following him, they found themselves in a wide hall with a fireplace in the middle. Though it was summer, there was a wood fire burning, and the smoke was rising to the blackened rafters in search of the way out through an opening in the roof. They passed through this dim hall, lit only by the fire and the hole above it, and came through another smaller door into a sort of veranda, propped open on wooden posts made of single tree trunks. It faced south and was still warm and filled with the light of the westering sun which slanted into it and fell golden on the garden full of flowers that came right up to the steps. Here they sat on wooden benches while Gandalf began his tale, and Bilbo swung his dangling legs and looked at the flowers in the garden, wondering what their names could be, as he had never seen half of them before. "I was coming over the mountains with a friend or two," said the wizard. "Or two. I only see one, and a little one at that," said Bjorn. "Well, to tell you the truth, I did not like to bother you with a lot of us until I found out if you were busy. I will give a call if I may." "Go on, call away." So Gandalf gave a long, shrill whistle, and presently Thorin and Dori came round the house by the garden path and stood bowing low before them. "1 or 3, you mean, I see," said Bjorn. "But these aren't hobbits, these are dwarves." "Thorin Oakenshield, at your service. Dori, at your service," said the 2 dwarves, bowing again. "I don't need your service, thank you," said Bjorn, "but I expect you need mine. I am not over fond of dwarves. But if it is true you are Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, I believe, that your companion is respectable, and that you are enemies of goblins, and not up to any mischief in my lands. What are you up to, by the way?" "They are on their way to visit the land of their fathers, away east beyond Mirkwood," put in Gandalf, "and it is entirely on accident that we are in your hands at all. In your lands at all. We were crossing by the high pass that should have brought us to the road that lies to the south of your country, when we were attacked by the evil goblins, as I was about to tell you." "Go on telling then," said Bjorn, who was never very polite. "There was a terrible storm. The stone giants were out, hurling rocks, and at the head of the pass we took refuge in a cave, the hobbit and I, and several of our companions." "Do you call 2 several?" "Well, no, as a matter of fact, there were more than 2. Where are they? Killed? Eaten? Gone home?" "Well, no, they don't seem to have all come when I whistled. Shy, I expect. You see, we are very much afraid that we are rather a lot for you to entertain. Go on, whistle again." "I'm in for a party, it seems, and 1 or 2 more won't make much difference," growled Bjorn. Gandalf whistled again, but Nori and Ori were there almost before he had stopped, for if you remember, Gandalf had told them to come in pairs every 5 minutes. "Hello," said Bjorn. "You came pretty quick. Where were you hiding?" "Coming in, my jack-in-the-boxes." "Nori at your service. Ori at—" they began, but Bjorn interrupted them. "Thank you. When I want your help, I will ask for it. Sit down, and let's get on with this tale, or it will be supper time before it's ended." "As soon as we were asleep," went on Gandalf, "a crack at the back of the cave opened. Goblins came out and grabbed the hobbit and the dwarves and our troop of ponies." "Troop of ponies? What were you, a traveling circus, or were you carrying lots of goods? Or do you always call 6 a troop?" And it goes on like this, is that Gandalf continues to tell the story and keeps making reference to a slightly higher number, and it's funny because he starts off with, it was me and Mr. Baggins and 1 or 2 friends, and then by the end there's 13 of these dwarves, And it occurs to me, and I think a lot of people, come to the same conclusion, that this is not the first time Gandalf has used this trick to sort of get, because if they all showed up at once, Bjorn would have just, get out of here. I don't want anything to do with you guys. And this is what he did to Bilbo in the beginning. If we remember, first one dwarf shows up, and, Bilbo was expecting company at this point. He was waiting for Gandalf to show up because he invited Gandalf for tea at 4, afternoon tea. And then, a dwarf shows up, and then another dwarf shows up, and then another dwarf shows up. And then it's not until the end when Gandalf shows up with Thorin, and there are 13 of them. And, Bilbo is serving all this food and sort of running around and taking all these orders for meals and such. And it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and, if Gandalf had showed up with 13 of them all at once, Bilbo would have been very, very upset by this. And what's interesting is that in the Rankin Bass movie version from the 70s, the animated cartoon of The Hobbit, that is actually what happened, is that Gandalf just sort of showed up with all 13 of them, or they were outside, and all the dwarves came all over the hill, after Gandalf had spoken to Bilbo. Of course, they were going through it rather quickly because it had to be rather short. They had to have room for commercials, and it was aimed at, I think, an even younger audience than what the book The Hobbit was. But nevertheless, we just see Gandalf being a little clever. Now, if you read Unfinished Tales, there's a story in there called The Quest for Erebor. And the Quest for Erebor sort of takes place during the Return of the King. And it could have been part of The Lord of the Rings. It's sort of a deleted scene, if you would. And much like the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, although that's in the appendix, or The Hunt for the Ring, which could have been somewhere probably in the Fellowship of the Ring, or perhaps later, because it makes references to Saruman that might not make, maybe in book 2 of the Fellowship of the Ring. But either way, there's a lot of these sort of parts of the Lord of the Rings that didn't wind up in the Lord of the Rings. And the Quest for Erebor actually helps reconcile The Hobbit with the Lord of the Rings, because it's a very different writing style, and it's a very different sort of feel and vibe to it. It's very fairy tale-ish. And, in The Hobbit, like, for example, they never mention the Shire. They never mention Middle-earth. They mention, the country of the hobbits, but they don't say that it's called the Shire. Middle-earth is referred to generally as the wide world, which sort of, goes into the Silmarillion a little bit, even though it wasn't originally written to have anything to do with the Silmarillion. There are numerous references to things like Gondolin and such like that. And Elrond, of course, is in it. So, Tolkien was just being a little cheeky with these references at first, but of course it is all connected, as we now know. But anyway, Melkor had put it into Feanor's head that, the elves were sort of just, the Noldor at least, were sort of stuck in Aemon, and that they would have been kings in Middle-earth, and Middle-earth is a lot bigger, and they referred to Aemon as this narrow land. And if you've ever looked up maps of Aemon, and the atlas is a little out of my reach, but it's basically shaped like a banana, and it's pretty big, though. There's room, and it's not all inhabited. There's Valinor, and there's Eldamar, and there are, there's wide country where there's nothing really, and because of this, it could be expanded. And then of course there's the islands like Tol Eressëa and the other smaller ones, but it's not anywhere near the size of Middle-earth. Middle-earth is very, very big, and Melkor makes the elves feel like they're trapped in a narrow land, and sort of thinking of the Undying Lands as the narrow world and Middle-earth as the wide world. You could kind of see where Tolkien was going with that. But anyway, the Quest for Erebor helps reconcile The Hobbit with The Lord of the Rings, because Gandalf explains a lot of sort of the behind-the-scenes things and tells a little bit of the story of The Hobbit from his perspective to the captive audience of the Hobbits, Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin, because this is after the fall of Sauron, and they're all in, I forget whether it was in Minas Tirith or whether it was in Rohan. I think it might have taken place in Rohan. I'd have to look again. And Gimli is there as well. Anyway, he explains that the version of The Hobbit that we're familiar with is what Bilbo wrote, but it's not necessarily the way it happened. For example, he describes that Thorin was a lot nastier in reality than he was in the way that Bilbo wrote him. And of course, Bilbo wrote the story after the fact, and Thorin had died, and they had become friends, and that they had become close, and then they had their issues, and they were, on the outs with each other. But then they came together and, on Thorin's deathbed, and they forgave each other, and they were friends again as Thorin died. And Gandalf sort of wonders, was Bilbo, at the time of the unexpected party, when all these dwarves were showing up, was he oblivious to how rude Thorin was, and how nasty Thorin was, and how little Thorin actually respected him as a person in his own home, nonetheless? Thorin may be a king, but he's a king of a far-off land. He's in the Shire. He's not a king in the Shire. And, you're in Bilbo's home. And what's interesting is that Bilbo had heard of Thorin. He knew who Thorin was. That's sort of interesting. Or at least that's what he wrote, that he knew who Thorin was, that Thorin was very famous, But what's interesting to me is, like I said, Gandalf is sort of musing. Was he oblivious? Did he just not recognize the way that Thorin was disrespecting him in his own home, the way that Thorin was nasty towards him? Or was he writing this to make Thorin look better because they had ended up as friends, and he didn't want to write Thorin too realistically, because this was a story that he was telling, and it was really his story, not Thorin's story. Of course, it is also Thorin's story, but the way that Bilbo tells it, it's Bilbo's story. I mean, it is, as far as we're concerned, it's Bilbo's story. It's called The Hobbit. It's not called, The Adventures of Thorin Oakenshield. So, it's interesting. Gandalf had clearly pulled this trick on Bilbo that he then pulls on Beorn. But none of this may have been the way that it actually happened, and that's sort of Gandalf's point, is that Bilbo's book is a broad strokes account of the events, and some of it was his own invention, some of it was just stuff that he thought was interesting that he wanted to put in there, and some of it was embellished, and some of it was de-emphasized, such as the personalities of some of the dwarves, like Mr. Thorin Oakenshield. So if you're a fan of The Hobbit and a fan of The Lord of the Rings, and you kind of feel like maybe they don't go together like super well, they're clearly written at two different time periods, even though they're published at two different time periods, but they're written in the way that Tolkien was in a very different headspace. He started writing The Lord of the Rings right after he finished The Hobbit, but it wasn't published for another 20 years. It took him a long time and many, many revisions. And of course, in the history of Middle-earth and the history of The Hobbit, the history of Middle-earth is a 12-volume series, with many of the volumes having to do with the Silmarillion, but there is a part, some of the volumes are specifically about the Lord of the Rings, and the history of the Hobbit is 2 volumes, although it's often sold as 1 these days, because they were rather short. One was called, I think, Return to Bag End, and the other was Mr. Baggins. Now it's just the history of the Hobbit. You usually get it as 1 book. But anyway, they give you his writing process and all the earlier drafts and the middle drafts and everything, and you can sort of see where Tolkien's head was at when you read these reference materials, and what he was thinking and how his thoughts grew and such. And I'm going on way too long, but I told you I had a lot to say about that section. Also, they mentioned bees. I had told a story once that I had gotten from Tumblr about a Tolkien Society meeting where they had a 6-hour argument about whether there were bees in Middle-earth, and they came to the conclusion after many hours of arguing, and I've told the story before, but maybe some of you haven't heard it, that there must be bees in Middle-earth because Meduseld, which is the home of Theoden, translates to mead hall. Mead, obviously, is made from honey, and honey is made by bees. And it's interesting because there's a lot of other references to honey, even in The Lord of the Rings. They drink mead. Certainly in Lothlorien, and I believe in Rivendell, there's mentions of, I think, honey cakes. And Beorn was a beekeeper. Beorn had bees, and he served a lot of honey. And I know if I had brought that up, if I was there, of course I wasn't there, but if I was there and I brought that up, they would have said, well, that's just the way that Bilbo told it, and it's not necessarily true. But it's like, well, where do you think Bilbo came up with the idea for bees? Just out of his head? It's sort of ridiculous. But he did create sort of an idea of a mythical, monstrously large bees, because there's a poem that you could read in the Adventures of Tom Bombadil called Errantry. I did a reading of it once here, and Errantry is about a knight fighting various whimsical creatures. One of them are giant bumblebees called Dumbledores, which is an Old English word that just literally means bumblebee. And the mention of the Dumbledores, is interesting because that poem, Errantry, was obviously Tolkien wrote it, but in universe was written by Bilbo Baggins, and the idea was that he had already been to Rivendell at this point, and the elves had told him some of the tales of the First Age, and I don't think he realized that they were true things that happened. Some of them, in living memory for some of these elves who were there for it. He isn't mentioned in The Hobbit, but Glorfindel was certainly there in Rivendell at that time, so he may have spoken to Bilbo, and he may have told him about, say, for example, the fall of Gondolin, or some of the other things that Glorfindel had witnessed. And, Bilbo might not have taken it seriously. He might have thought that these are sort of just their elves' myths and fairy stories and such, and wanted to write something like that wasn't necessarily true, but just this grand tale, but from like a more of a Hobbit level of it, So that's where Errantry comes from, and of course, but he mentions bees, and I don't think that he would have created a creature that was a giant bee if there wasn't a such thing as a bee. So that's another thing to mention about this, that, bees are mentioned. But anyway, let's get to your questions. We only have 10, but a few of them I'm going to talk on quite a bit. So here we go. Let's go to your first question. Our first question comes in by the request of Jojo, and Jojo actually asked me this a while back, and this is a question that I sat on for a while because I realized it's a very short, simple question, but I realized that I had to think on it a bit and write something a bit more than just a little bit, a few paragraphs or such. So I finally got to it. Here it is. How did the ring change Gollum? So Gollum essentially became more of himself. The film version, the Peter Jackson version of The Lord of the Rings, gives us an abridged and somewhat limited version of Gollum's origins. He was a Stoor named Smeagol, who was on a fishing trip with his friend, also a relation of some sort, Deagle. Deagle finds the ring. Smeagol loses his mind over it. He murders Deagle, and then he wanders around eating fish, forgetting everything about himself, including his own name. It's only part of the picture, and it makes sense for it to be only part of the picture in the movie. This is the reason I bring up the movie, because this depicts the origin of Gollum as told by Gollum. He's literally narrating this part of the film. Now, of course, in the book, it's filtered through Gandalf, so it's a little bit different. Gandalf explains Gollum's origins to Frodo, noting that he had to work hard at getting the truth out of him, and some educated guesswork was used as well. In The Hobbit, Gollum refers to the ring as his birthday present. It came to him on his birthday. He keeps repeating that over and over again. And this is the truth. But of course, it leaves out the fact that he murdered someone to get it. It's easy to take this version of events as told by Gollum himself at face value, and you might feel some sympathy for him. And sympathy is different from pity, of course. We have to make that distinction. But Tolkien's intention was that Smeagol was a terrible person to begin with. In his letters, Tolkien described Deagle as a mean little soul. That's the exact quote. And then he said that Smeagol was meaner and greedier. They were not just two buddies, going out on a fishing trip for one of their birthdays. And while the One Ring certainly did its magic on Smeagol, it could not have made him do something that he wasn't already capable of. So if we examine The Hobbit, and we see Bilbo, newly in possession of the One Ring, contemplate killing Gollum. He does not. And his internal reasoning in this very harried sort of scene is that it's not a fair fight. Exact quote there, not a fair fight. As he is armed and he is invisible and Gollum is neither of these things. We can surmise, and somewhat strongly, that the sudden thought of murdering Gollum probably came from the ring, but Bilbo wasn't capable of murder, even though he did throw rocks at birds for no particular reason. Smeagol and Deagol were already upset at each other. Now we're getting into information that comes from the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. And in the letter that I'm referring to, Tolkien is explaining to somebody who asked the question why the riverside stores, such as Smeagol here, were receiving gifts on their birthday rather than giving away gifts. Now, The Hobbit doesn't talk much about birthdays other than Bilbo's birthday happens when he arrives in Esgaroth, Lake Town, and that Smeagol calls the ring his birthday present, and that it came to him on his birthday. And at this point in the writing, before The Lord of the Rings, and only connected to the Silmarillion by way of a few cute little references, Smeagol's not even a hobbit yet. Tolkien hasn't decided that he's a hobbit. The ring is just a magic ring, and he hasn't decided. It may have belonged to the necromancer, who may or may not be this guy named Thu from an early version of the Silmarillion. So it's not yet all coalesced into what we know, is what I'm getting at here. It's not yet there. But in The Lord of the Rings, we learn that hobbits have this culture of giving away gifts on their birthday instead of receiving gifts on their birthday. And somebody, of course, wrote a letter saying, well, then why, if Gollum was a hobbit, was he getting gifts on his birthday rather than receiving gifts on his birthday? And, of course, there's a great, fantastic letter with a lot of detail written by Tolkien that explains a whole lot more than just the answer to that. Now, Gollum's youth was not so long ago that the Shire customs were not yet established. The Shire is far older than Gollum, and his people were of a kind that initially did live in the Shire, but did not find the location or the culture to their liking, and they remigrated to their origin point. The fact that this is brought up by Tolkien in a discussion of gift-giving customs makes me often wonder if the show of generosity by celebrating hobbits in the Shire was a major or even a minor factor in this faction of stores leaving. And keep in mind, it wasn't all the stores that left, it was just some of them. Tolkien notes that gifts in this community would be given upwards, mostly from child to parent, and Smeagol's grandmother, as the matriarch of their clan, would receive the lion's share of gifts on her birthday. Gifts between equals were not commonly given, but Smeagol doesn't see Deagol as his equal, but as his lesser, his weaker relation. Deagol had given Smeagol a gift for his birthday. We don't know what it was, but he begrudged it. He was a nasty, greedy sort, and on top of that, Smeagol didn't think it was really all that good of a gift. He thought it was unsatisfactory, whatever it was. Contrast is to the Shire hobbits. They give away trinkets. They call them mathams. Little things that have no real value. They have no real use. They're just fun to have. The exception, of course, was Bilbo, because he gave away rather extravagant gifts, and they were often very thoughtful gifts, even if the thoughts were oftentimes quite waspish, like giving a bookcase to someone who was known to borrow books and never return them. So what I'm getting at here is that as far as hobbits are concerned, Gollum is about as far from Bilbo as you can imagine in terms of morality. Bilbo's not perfect, but he is a good person. Smeagol is vile. The One Ring just made him more vile. He had a preference for young meat. See his comments on the rabbits, enjoying goblin flesh if it was a child, eating babies in Mirkwood. He was cruel, he was a liar, he was a sneak. He used the One Ring to steal, to cause mischief, eventually being turned out of his community by his own grandmother, the only person he had on his side who could no longer turn the other cheek on his evil. Gandalf states that Gollum is deserving of pity, and with time, Frodo comes to the same conclusion. This doesn't mean that he's a good person, just that without the One Ring, he never would have been much more than, say, a local troublemaker. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Laurie Smith, who asks, how does Gandalf get his sword Glamdring back after his escape from Orthanc? Well, to get it back would suggest that he at some point didn't have it. This happens a lot. People ask after Gandalf escapes from Orthanc, how did he get his sword back, or how did he get his staff back? Or the same thing after he died and came back to life. How did he get his staff? How did he get his sword? How did he get his ring? The answer's quite simple. He always had these things. He never didn't have them. In the film version, he has a battle with Saruman, who brings him to the top of the tower during the battle and taunts him for a while, and then Gandalf leaps off the tower onto Gwaihir and flies away. In the book, though, it was different. Gandalf knew that fighting Saruman would be too destructive, foolish, and a likely loss. Saruman told him that he was now detained and led him to the top of the tower and left him there. He did not take his staff. He did not take his sword. He was sure in his mind that after a few days to cool off at the top of the tower, Gandalf would certainly come around and join him. He considered it akin to putting Gandalf in a timeout. When he went to check on him a few days later, he found that Gandalf was gone. The reason that Gandalf went to Orthanc in the first place was that as he was going to the Shire to help Frodo, he ran into Radagast the Brown, sitting outside the Shire waiting for him. Radagast had been told by Saruman that Gandalf must go to Orthanc urgently, and so he left immediately, only stopping to write a letter to Frodo, which, due to the forgetfulness of one Mr. Barlam and Butterbur, was never delivered. Gandalf asked Radagast to send a messenger to bring news and to seek news after a few days, which turned out to be Gwaihir. Gwaihir was dismayed to find Gandalf at the top of the tower asking for a ride and refused to bring him all the way to the north, but Gandalf was quite happy to be dropped off in Rohan, which was close by. He still, of course, had his sword and his staff with him, and when he died, by the way, he died in battle, essentially, well, or rather right after a battle of exhaustion. So he likely had his sword still, in his hand. He was probably still gripping it when he died, and when Gwaihir came and scooped him up with his talons and took him away, Gandalf was holding the sword. And of course his ring would have still been on his finger. His staff was gone at that point. It had broken when he broke the bridge of Khazad Dûm, but when he got to Lothlorien, he got a new staff from Galadriel, likely fashioned from a Malern tree, which is a little bit of the Undying Lands there for him. So there we have. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Richard Seymour, who asks, how would our understanding of magic in Middle-earth change if the Lord of the Rings point of view were from Gandalf or Galadriel's perspective instead of from the Hobbits? So, I don't think our understanding of magic would change, but I think our understanding of these characters would change, and the way that they view magic. Using the word magic around an elf, for example, is always a tricky thing. When it's brought up, they seem confused. Galadriel admits to Samwise that she doesn't know what he means when he says elf magic. And after she allowed both him and Frodo to use the Mirror of Galadriel, she asks Sam if he thinks that counts as elf magic. This is a genuine question. Galadriel does not understand what Samwise means. To the elves, magic is the device of the enemy, referring to the likes of Morgoth and Sauron, while what they do is just using their own abilities that they naturally have. There is magic of elves, magic of men, magic of dwarves, magic of orcs. Even hobbits were said to have everyday magic. That's described as, how they're naturally quiet, for example, which would seem magical to the likes of a dwarf, but to a hobbit, it's just how they are, and from their perspective, dwarves are just really loud when they move around. Bilbo says a lot, this dwarfish racket. If you want to read The Lord of the Rings from a different perspective, that of Elrond, just open up the Silmarillion and go to the last chapter of The Rings of Power in the Third Age. It's not very descriptive, as the Silmarillion is not about descriptions, it's about events, but it has a different perspective, an elvish perspective. Gandalf also narrates several portions of The Lord of the Rings, so you can see his perspective there, most notably at the Council of Elrond, but also the way he speaks in The Hobbit gives his perspective of magic. It's just a matter of understanding a device, the abilities of others. And I wanted to highlight two of the comments that I got on this question, which are both, I think, very good comments. Bruce Allen Wilson wrote, "For elves, magic isn't what they do, it is what they are." Just thumbs up, Bruce. Absolutely fantastically correct. And Marty Strassinger wrote, "Hobbits think elves have magic in the same way that I marvel at the singing of Dmitri, I'm going to say this wrong, Hrostovsky." I hope that's right. "To the late Dmitri, a world-class singing is just another Tuesday, but to his fans, it's magic." And that just thumbs up, Marty. Absolutely fantastically correct. That's exactly the way that we should think about magic in Tolkien's universe. But there is also the other magic, the capital M magic, the device of the enemy, the things that Sauron does, the things that Morgoth does, necromancy, for example. But, that's sort of different. And that's why elves sort of rankle. Sid brings this up a lot when, you use the same word for what we do as for the device of the enemy. That's confusing to us. So there you go. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Nick Smith, and this is one of those questions that is really interesting to me because it seems like a bad question, but it's not necessarily a bad question, and I'm going to explain that in a bit. But here it is. Why couldn't Sauron march east around the mountains of Mordor and take over the north and then the west? So I don't like to normally answer a question with a question, but I kind of have to here. Why would he do that is the real good question here. Mordor is protected on three sides by a range of mountains they're called the Ash Mountains, in a configuration very similar to that of Hithlum from the First Age. And with the note that Melkor himself had created Orodruin, I believe that was in the Peoples of Middle-earth, it is likely that Mordor was Melkor's creation, even if he did not use it. This being said, the primary enemy of Mordor is Gondor. Of course, the elves in the north, they're also his enemy, but they're not currently attacking him. Now, here's a few reasons why the scenario in question wouldn't work out very well for Sauron. One, if he did this, if he were to attack the north, he has forces out of Rhûn, though, to do that for him. He doesn't need to. And they are, in fact, attacking the north in The Lord of the Rings, held off in a climactic battle against the likes of the forces of Dale and Erebor. And, of course, this is where Dain, the second Ironfoot king under the mountain, died, as did King Brand, son of Bane, son of Bar. While sending his troops from Mordor to back up the runic warriors, the Easterlings, that would have ensured victory in the north. But that leads us to the next point. If he emptied Mordor of his troops in this fashion to take this long trip around the mountains towards the north, it would leave Mordor, Barad-dûr, his fortress, sort of defenseless from an invasion from Gondor. And that did happen in the past. The elves and the men came in the Second Age and invaded Mordor, and he was defeated at this point. And then the last point is that emptying Mordor of his troops in that direction would have made it really easy for Frodo and Sam to get to Mount Doom. For example, they wouldn't have been caught by orcs and sidetracked for a bit. So don't think of Sauron's forces as just being in Mordor. His territory, it just was midnight and the fireworks are going off, so it's the explosions you're hearing if the microphone's picking them up. I'm sorry about that. Happy New Year. I was hoping that we wouldn't get fireworks because it's raining, and I do have a dog who gets scared of fireworks. But all right. But don't think of Mordor as being that's Sauron's territory. His territory extends far to the east, far to the south, far to the north. Gondor was the last bastion of defense against Mordor, much as Dale and Erebor were the last bastion of defense against Rhûn. And the war was being fought in more than one place. Now, to return to what I said earlier about, it seems like a bad question, but it's really not. I found out, like I said, it was requested by Nick Smith, and he left me a comment, and I found out that this question came from a child, and that his kid asked him this question, and he didn't know. His little boy asked him, and he said, let me go to Quora. And this is really great. This is why Quora is so great. And he went to Quora, and he didn't come from my YouTube or anything, as far as I know, but he went to Quora, and he typed in a question, and he got a list of people that could answer it, and he clicked on my name at the top of the list, and probably some other names, I would imagine, as well. And I got the question, and he says, oh, that's great. I'm going to talk with my son about it and see what he makes of it. So, yeah. So sometimes something seems like, well, that's not a great question, but it's coming from a child. It's coming from a little boy. So, I wish I had known that before I wrote anything, because I would have explained it more as I would explain it to a child. But, that's fine. I'm sure that Nick can explain it to his son now and have the words to do that. So sometimes, yeah, kids ask questions. There's sort of this old say, like where a kid keeps asking questions. And you say, why do you ask so many questions? Like, well, because I don't know anything yet. So there we have it. Let's move on to the next question. Okay, here's a question that comes in by the request of Cat B, who asks, what exactly is in the Phial of Galadriel? Is it trapped light or a fragment of the Silmaril? Was never quite clear on its exact nature. So it's not part of a Silmaril. It was only compared to a Silmaril. The Phial itself seems to be made out of glass. And Galadriel herself actually explains what is in it, a mixture of the light of Eärendil and the waters of the Mirror of Galadriel. Sam later compared it to a Silmaril. He stated that as the light of Eärendil is itself a Silmaril, it had the same light, and that in using the Phial of Galadriel, they were using the same power that Beren took from Morgoth. Sam's point was the old stories never end. He's realizing that he's a part of the same story that had Beren and Luthien in it. But it also is foreshadowing. It sets up the use of the Phial of Galadriel against Shelob, as she is blinded by the light, and in her panic, she tried to crush Sam with her body weight and impale herself on Sting. It cannot be a piece of a Silmaril, because they are unbreakable. No violence may mar them in Arda until its conclusion, meaning that they would only be broken at the end of the world. It is for the same reason that the Arkenstone is not a Silmaril and not connected to the Silmarils. The Arkenstone was found by the dwarves and then cut by them. If it was one of the lost Silmarils, they would not have been able to cut it. It is essentially a creation of Galadriel and a demonstration of how different she was from her uncle Feanor, who created the Silmarils, but refused to share their light with others, while Galadriel is freely giving this light to Frodo. We see a similar note between Galadriel and Gimli, as he states that the greatest gift that could come from her would be a strand of her hair. She asks Gimli, what would you do with it? What would you do with a strand of my hair? And Feanor had once asked her for 3 strands of hair to make into gems, and Gimli says that he would make them into gems, but most importantly, he said that the beauty of these gems would be put on display to be enjoyed by all. In this, she sees that Gimli he's like Feanor in one way, but he's not like Feanor in that other way, and she gives him 3 strands of her hair. The Phial would also not have the ability to burn evil that touches it like the Silmarils do, because although it blinded Shelob because she did not love light, touching it wouldn't burn her as the Silmarils burned Melkor and Mathros and Maglor, as that was caused by those gems specifically being hollowed by Varda herself. I also want to draw attention to one of the comments I got here from Peter Kisher, who was musing on this, the whole Phial of Galadriel thing after watching one of the movies. And he says, the Silmarils were made with the light of the 2 trees. The light of Eärendil is produced by one of the Silmarils. The light of the Phial of Galadriel is the preserved light of Eärendil. So in a way, it is the indirect, or maybe perhaps even diluted, light of the trees. Ungoliant was the one who killed the 2 trees, and Shelob was a child of Ungoliant. So in a roundabout way, by lingering the lingering effects of the thing Ungoliant destroyed, were able to help confront and thwart one of the other evils that Ungoliant brought into the world. An excellent point, and absolutely something that I would say 100% Tolkien intended this. It was all coming, full circle and being cyclical. Good wins in the end. One of the very first things that was said in the Silmarillion was Iluvatar, God, speaking to Melkor, Satan, and saying, basically, nothing you do is going to matter in the end if you rebel against me. You're going to lose, and when you try to destroy the beauty that I've created, you are only going to make it more beautiful. Evil loses in the end. That's the whole point of Tolkien's world. That doesn't mean that we can sit back and go, oh, well, they're going to lose, so let's just, we have to make that happen, because we have to try to ease the suffering and the pain caused by evil. We have to help each other. We have to come together. These are all themes that are just all over Tolkien's work. But it is important to note that good does win in the end, and that, yeah, you could see Ungoliant drank the light from the two trees and withered them, and they died. But so forth was brought not only the light of Yarandil, because those were made before the destruction of the trees, but think of this. When God said to Morgoth, Melkor, you will create things more beautiful. Think about it this way. If Melkor and Ungoliant never destroyed the two trees, the sun and the moon never would have happened. Middle-earth would have been dark. Yeah, they had starlight, of course, but they didn't have the moon and they didn't have the sun until after the trees were destroyed, and we got a part of the children of the trees, essentially. The daughter of Laurelin the Gold, the sun carried by Arien across the sky. The flower, the son of Tilion, the son of Telperion. Tilion carries it across the sky. That's the moon. And they don't light just the Undying Lands. They light the whole world. Everybody could see them. People in Middle-earth could see them. And Morgoth could see them. And then he knows what it is as soon as he sees the sun. And he knows that he's lost that battle. He destroyed the light. Okay. He destroyed the two lamps. They made the trees. The trees were more beautiful than the lamps. The lamps were always on. There was no day or night. So now we had starlight, and in the Undying Lands we got these two wonderful, beautiful trees with day and night cycles. He destroys the light again. Now the light is out of his reach. It's in the sky. He can't get up there. He's incarnated himself into this Dark Lord form. He is now more limited than he was in the past, and the sun is up there being carried by Arien, destroying his trolls, giving pain to his goblins. And I might mention that he has a history with Arien. She burned him in the past too, so he doesn't want to come near her. She's pretty fierce. So there's that as well. So yeah, absolutely great comment, Peter, and it led me to talking about the sun and the moon here, which is important to this discussion and the discussion of light in Tolkien's work. All right, let's move on to the next question. Okay, so this next question was not written by a person. It was requested by a person, but it was not written by a person. A while back, a few episodes ago, I mentioned the Quora prompt generator, which is an AI tool that Quora uses to pump more questions out. And I said that I was working with some of the employees at Quora to try to improve it. And I think it's futile. I think it's a fool's task, but I have to try anyway. I feel like Gandalf in this sense, because he's a fool's hope, right? I don't think that AI can ask good questions, but I've been working with some of the core employees, and we're working on a system where perhaps AI questions could be vetted. But anyway, even if a question isn't written by a person could see it on there and then tag me in it, and that's what happened here. So the question comes in by the request of Dante Martinez, and you guys are going to laugh when you hear this. How did Gandalf discover that Frodo and Bilbo were related in The Hobbit? And this is sort of endemic of how these AI questions work and why they're bad. I used to ignore prompts like this because they're just so bad. But a mixture of me trying to help Quora improve them and the fact that someone did ask me to answer this well. Let's just examine how badly the AI messed up this time. Firstly, for Gandalf discovering that Frodo and Bilbo were related, the fact that they have the same last name is kind of a big giveaway, don't you think? It is, of course, possible for two people to have the same last name and not be related, of course, but that's unusual for hobbits. When Frodo came to Bree, he used the assumed name Mr. Underhill. He didn't even come up with that on his own. That was Gandalf's idea. But in the Prancing Pony, there were several hobbits named Underhill. It is noted that these guys that are hanging, they're from Bree, and they're hanging out in the Prancing Pony, and they can't imagine having the same name as someone and not being related. So they treat Frodo as if he were a long-lost relative. That being said, hobbits take great care to examine their family trees. Their own genealogy is of great interest to them, and they are constantly noting who is related to who and how. What's interesting and pointed out almost right away in The Lord of the Rings is that though he's called Uncle Bilbo to Frodo, they're actually cousins. And by a quirk of their family tree, they are both first cousins and second cousins, once removed either way. That being said, the prompt also specifies that this is in The Hobbit, and, Frodo wasn't born yet. The very start of The Lord of the Rings is 60 years after The Hobbit, and Frodo was 33 years old at the very start of The Lord of the Rings. The math, as they say, is not mathing. AI questions are not always bad, but they're usually bad. And this is why human oversight on prompts is not only desired, but absolutely needed. Too many prompts are based off of false information or are two unrelated questions mashed together. And Quora is aware of these issues, and they are working on it, but this shows that there's still quite a way to go. And I'm willing to help, even though I think it's a fool's errand. I am willing to help. Perhaps I am a fool as well. But the reason that I do sometimes choose to address questions such as this, not only because somebody answered me, but because just the question existing is a form of misinformation. Because if you see this question, let's say you really don't know much about the Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, other than maybe you saw the films once or twice or something, you never read the books, and you see this, how did Gandalf discover that Frodo and Bilbo were related in The Hobbit? And you might think, oh, Frodo must have been in The Hobbit. I think I saw Elijah Wood in that movie. I'm not sure. It's sort of one of those things where you're like, sometimes there's a false premise, and I don't want people to believe that premise. So I have to say, okay, I can't really answer it as written because the premise is wrong, and here's why. And this is how we combat misinformation. Not answering bad questions, but pulling them apart. And of course, sometimes these sort of questions come from people, and they're having a misunderstanding, or sometimes English isn't their first language, or whatever, and I can sort of figure out something to talk about in the question and sort of figuring out where they're coming from. Or sometimes I'll even message this person and see, like, could you explain the question to me a little bit? I'm having a hard time understanding what you're getting at, and this is borne fruit a few times. But in this case, it is AI, and AI is sort of a mess. There's sort of like, there's people that think it's the most wonderful thing in the world and it's the solution to everything, and there's people that think it's the most terrible thing in the world and is absolute garbage and can never do anything good. And then there's me, where I'm like, I can see the positive applications, but it's a mess. Right now, it's a mess. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Thomas Olson, who asks, what do you think would happen if you managed to wear all 19 rings of power at the same time on your fingers and toes? Thank you for the question. It's so funny. I'm sorry. Every once in a while, I like ridiculous questions. Not questions that are full of misinformation, but questions that are silly. And this is silly, and I like silly questions sometimes. I do have a serious answer for a silly question. I really do. Though this is somewhat dependent on who currently holds the One Ring, probably nothing happens. So I have this image here. That's Green Lantern. And it isn't like this. Green Lantern lost his mind. This is a story from the 90s. he started collecting a bunch of these rings, and it made him unbelievably powerful because those rings are weapons. The rings of power, they're not weapons. It is said in The Lord of the Rings by the wise that the rings confer power according to stature. The more powerful you are, the more you'll get out of one of these rings. This is why the likes of Galadriel and Elrond, two characters who have and actively are using their rings, get the most out of them. But note that those two particular rings, as well as the one that Gandalf wears, are a bit different from the other 16. They were made by Celebrimbor alone, with no help from other elves, and most importantly, no help from Sauron. They are made to protect against time and against evil. This is why Gandalf does not age, while Saruman does. Gandalf was already old when he arrived from the west, while Saruman was, well, not young, but younger. He had black hair. And this is why Rivendell, and especially Lothlorien, are safe places where evil cannot enter. And Lothlorien even has a timeless quality. I'm going to be talking about this in a few answers, actually, today. Reminiscent of the Undying Lands. The Fellowship spent an entire month in Lothlorien, but it didn't feel like they did. Sam was confused as they were coming out of Lothlorien. He felt like, what are we, like, there for 10 days? How is the moon in the same phase that it was when we arrived in Lothlorien? And he wondered, did time stop while we were there? Which was an idea that Tolkien played with for a while. Or did he just somehow not realize that he'd spent a full month in Lothlorien? And Aragorn steps in and says, no, we actually spent a full month there. It's just that there's something about this place that makes it like that. And then Frodo blurts out, oh, it's because of Galadriel's ring, the ring of power that the Lady Galadriel wears. And Aragorn's like, you really shouldn't have said that out loud. Even to me, that's a secret you should have kept. If you had all three of Celebrimbor's rings, and you and the area around you would just be very protected from the effects of time, evil would not be able to come anywhere near you. The other rings were said to confer power, but we don't really know what that means. What did that power entail, other than a sort of pseudo-immortality, a lack of aging, a lack of weariness? I don't believe this effect would stack, as the effect is a lack of something, a lack of aging, a lack of weariness. You can't have an extra lack of something. This is, of course, assuming that the One Ring is either lost or held by the likes of Gollum or Bilbo or Frodo. If Sauron has the One Ring, if there's a Lord of the Rings, he would enslave you. And I don't believe the power conferred by most of the rings would stack, but I think that wearing all 16 of the rings, which, by the way, I don't know why you'd have to wear them on your toes. You could put more than one ring on a finger. Just saying. But if you wore all 16 of the rings that he helped create, that would make it a lot easier and I think a lot faster for him to ensnare you, and you would become his eternal slave. You would be like a Nazgul. The other three would offer no protection against this. And we know this because of the actions of Galadriel and Gil-galad and Círdan in the Second Age. They didn't wear or use their rings once they were perceived the existence of the One. They are still rings of power, despite being different, and the spell was one ring to rule them all, not one ring to rule 16, or one ring to rule 19. The first command that Sauron would give you would be, get your ridiculous self to Barad-dûr and take off all but one of these rings and surrender them to him, where he will redistribute them to people who have a lot more common sense than to wear 19 rings of any type. And maybe the ones that were on your toes would be rinsed off first. I don't know. Sauron is obsessed with order, so I would assume he's somewhat obsessed with cleanliness as well. Let's move on to the next question. So here's a question that came in from a colleague of mine, Jeffrey Claburn, who is asking this not just specifically of me, but of a bunch of us that are all colleagues and write not just on Tolkien, but on fantasy worlds in general, although Jeffrey does write about Tolkien quite a bit. Is there a limit to a dragon's ability to breathe fire in a limited amount of time? Feel free to answer to any specific story, such as Tolkien, A Song of Ice and Fire, Harry Potter, Dragon Riders of Pern, or Fourth Ring. So I'm assuming that this was asked in a group, a writers group that is specifically of fantasy. And since I'm one of the Tolkien people there, I mean, Jeffrey is as well, but since he's the one asking, I decided to step in and speak just on the Tolkien side of things. So, speaking from Tolkien's standpoint, there is no evidence to suggest any sort of limit other than perhaps stamina. Not all of Tolkien's dragons could breathe fire. There were multiple types of dragons in the world. Some had wings, and some did not, for example. The first ever dragon, Glaurung, could breathe fire, and he was wingless and flightless. He could breathe fire, but he could also issue forth a foul-smelling vapor that caused confusion and disorientation and even memory loss. Winged dragons that could breathe fire first appeared during the War of Wrath. Chief among them was Ancalagon the Black. Tolkien mentions a few different types of dragons, such as longworms and such, and it seems that the two major divisions of types of dragons are whether or not they could breathe fire and whether or not they could fly. The type that could breathe fire were called Uraloke in Quenya, which translates as fire serpent. And sometimes they were also called fire drakes. Though from the common, thought of dragon taxonomy, drake usually refers to a flightless dragon. There were also cold drakes who could not breathe fire, though they could issue forth an icy breath that would cause those affected by it to be struck by immense fear. Dragons that could both fly and breathe ice may have existed, though the only reference to them is in the Book of Lost Tales, which is questionable canon. And I say canon doesn't really exist as far as the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's universe goes, but as far as it does, that's sort of out of canon. It's an alternate sort of take on, these stories, the way that men tell them, just like The Hobbit is the story the way that Bilbo told it, not necessarily the way it happened, as I mentioned earlier. So, and it is possible, though unproven, that as the father of all dragons, that Glaurung may have been able to use this ability as well. So whether or not whether it's fire breath or ice breath or the reeking steam that Glaurung used, no comment was ever made by Tolkien on there being limitations on it. Dragons are not natural creatures in Tolkien's world, and these abilities are magical in nature, and it may tire them out after a time, as they are incarnate, and we see that excessive use of magic can wear out the user. Magic, as we mentioned earlier, as a term in Tolkien's world, is usually referring to whatever device of a race that is inherent to their racial characteristic, but missing in other races. So while dragons are unnatural, their ability is nature to them. That being said, I would imagine that the limitations of a dragon's breath is limited only by their own stamina, meaning that some dragons may be able to use quite a bit of it for a very long time, while others may tire faster and need to rest. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Thomas Olson, who asks, this is sort of similar to the earlier question about what if you put on all the rings. But what happens if you wear a ring of power for too long? It depends on which ring it is, and it depends on who you are. If we understand that the bearers of the three immediately started taking up and wearing their rings after the fall of Sauron and the subsequent loss of the One Ring at Gladden Fields, then we can understand that during the Lord of the Rings, Galadriel and Elrond have been wearing their rings for 3,019 years. Gandalf, for less. He arrived in Middle-earth in the Third Age, 1,000, so he would have been worn his ring for 2,019 years, with Círdan having worn it before then. None of them have had any ill effect, and Gandalf did not age. I mentioned this earlier. When the wizards arrived over the sea, they were not young, but only Gandalf was an old man. Círdan described Saruman as having black hair. But during the War of the Ring, he now looked enough like Gandalf that some confuse the two. These particular rings are meant to preserve against the effects of time and to protect against evil. Gandalf has extra stamina, for instance. The rest of the rings confer power, but what power that is varies based on who's wearing it. Power according to stature, as the wise say. Men become wraiths after a time, and they fell under Sauron's control, while dwarves became greedy and reckless, but they did not fall under Sauron's control. The One Ring We see the effects of this on some. Isildur could not wear it after a while. It rejected him. Isildur was different from most. He saw the one as precious, and he did not wish to mar it in any way, but he also wished to master its power. The One Ring, for lack of a better term, fought back, and after 2 years, he found it painful to even touch the ring, and he saw the wisdom that Elrond had, and now he did want it gone. The ring actively distanced itself from him and escaped as soon as it could. Isildur was essentially too good and too strong for the One Ring. Gollum, we see the effects. He lived over 600 years, far longer than his kind normally does, and over time became a creature that no longer resembled a hobbit. Gollum did wear the ring constantly for a while, but like Isildur, it started to distance itself from him. Eventually, he did not care to wear the ring so much, and he kept it in his pocket, but after a while it galled him. That was the exact word that Tolkien used. It galled him to have the ring close to his skin, and he kept it in a secret place, only taking it out and wearing it when he needed it to hunt for food. Gollum was a terrible person, and the ring made him worse. You see, a lot of the earlier answers are coming into this one. Bilbo was negatively affected by the One, and Frodo was negatively affected by the One. In Bilbo, it was trying to get away from him, while also keeping him young-looking. Frodo was ensnared pretty early, but used it far less than Bilbo. But as he got closer to Mordor, it weighed him down and affected both his mental and physical stamina. Of course, wearing any of the 19 Rings of Power while there is a Lord of the Rings is a bad idea, whether they're on your fingers or your toes, which is why Galadriel and Elrond only took up the use of their rings once the one was lost. Okay, let's move on to the final question. Our final question also comes in from Thomas Olson, who asks, what would be a normal day for Frodo, Sam, Bilbo, or Gimli once they arrived in the Blessed Realm? I love this question. Love it. The reason I love this question is that any prospective answer exists only in the realm of surmise. Based on what we know from Tolkien's work, there is no definitive answer of what their typical days would be like. This is where we could let our imaginations flex, and that's something that Tolkien was rather fond of. Based on what we know of the Undying Lands from the Silmarillion, their lives would have been peaceful and not terribly long, at least in their own perception and the perceptions of the immortal and eternal beings that dwell there. Though not shortened by the magic of the realm, as some believe, their lives would feel shorter. This goes into what I was talking about earlier about Lothlorien, which is the place in Middle-earth that is most like the Undying Lands, due to Galadriel's use of the ring Nenya. Sam was confused. He left the realm. The moon phases were the same as when he arrived. Aragorn explains, Lothlorien has a timeless quality. Time gets away from you, and your life seems to go by very quickly. So Bilbo was already 131 years old when he sailed to the west, and a bit senile. Even though physically he was around 70 or so, mentally he was 131 years old, the oldest hobbit to have ever lived. Knowing Bilbo's age, knowing his demeanor and his habits, he probably spent most of his time resting and conversing with the elves. He had given up smoking, and he had not written any songs in quite a while due to his work on translating Elvish lore, but I think he would take up writing again for the rest of his years, and that he would write a lot of great songs about the elves, about the Ainur, and such. Frodo was a lot younger. He was in his 50s, though physically in his 30s. Out of all of those that sailed to the west, he would have therefore spent the most time actually living there. It would take him a while to heal fully, after which he would likely, I think he would find a place somewhere that he could live that reminded him of the Shire, and that he would live out his life peacefully. He was a lot like Bilbo, just without that tookish wanderlust. So a Frodo in his 50s is less desiring to go out wandering than Bilbo was. He loved the Shire. He never really wanted to leave it. He just kind of had to. So I think that he would try to emulate life in the Shire in the Undying Lands and just sort of live the way that he had lived before everything just went horribly wrong. Sam was nearly 100 years old when he sought the Havens. And we aren't told whether or not he arrived safely, though of course I would like to imagine that he did. His wife had passed, his children were grown with children of their own, and he was nearing the end of his own life. Sailing to the west would have just one goal for him, to see Frodo again. Frodo was older than Sam, but with his aging being halted for around 17 years by the One Ring, it is very likely that Frodo may have still been alive when Sam sailed to the west. It would be, I think, both poetic and beautiful to think that they may have died together. But before that happens, I believe that they would have spent at least a few years, hopefully, enjoying each other's company. Sam would tell Frodo of all the goings-on in Middle-earth, everything that's happened, and of course he would have lots of stories about his children and his grandchildren and everything that Merry and Pippin did, and, just basically just catch him up on that. And I think there were others in the Undying Lands, perhaps not, just Frodo, but Gandalf would love to hear all this stuff too, so there's that as well. Gimli was 262 years old, very old for a dwarf, and he expressed the thought that he wished one thing. He knew he was dying, but he wanted to see Galadriel one last time before he died. Legolas took him to the west, and unlike Sam, we are told that they do arrive safely. Tolkien used the phrase, "and so over the sea," to describe their journey. I like to believe that Gimli would have brought perhaps one of the 3 gems that he would have created from Galadriel's hair to show to her, while the other 2 would remain on display, whether it's in the... I think they would be in the Glittering Caves initially, but I think at some point they'd be moved to Moria. I also would love to believe that Gimli would get to meet his creator, Aula, before he passed on. And dwarves don't have an afterlife, so he would sit in Mandos until the end of the world and perhaps have a deep, meaningful conversation with Feanor about why Galadriel gave Gimli his hair. We talked about this a little bit on the Council of Tolkien, and I don't think there would be gloating involved, but I think that once he's, some people in the comments on Quora was saying, well, why Feanor wouldn't talk to a dwarf, But this is a very different Feanor. This is not first age Feanor. This is, I've been sitting in Mandos for thousands of years Feanor, and I think he's going to approach Gimli and say, what did you do, or what did you say that she gave you her hair? And I think that he would just be made to repeat exactly what he said to Galadriel. And I think that some understanding may dawn on Feanor as to why she wouldn't give her hair to him, but did to this dwarf. Of course, Feanor is the type of person that would think of dwarves as lesser beings. Galadriel very much not so, And I think that, yes, Feanor would not enjoy being around dwarves in the first age. But this, like I said, this isn't the first stage. He would have other people there, like Celebrimbor. Now, Celebrimbor at this point might be reincarnated, so perhaps he's not still in Mandos. He's walking around, in like Tyrion upon Tuna or something. But he would have been in Mandos for a time. He absolutely would have been in Mandos for a time. And I think that at this point, he would have a conversation with his grandfather, Anyway, guys, that has been our last question. I really did enjoy these. I'm sort of leaning towards the thought of doing less questions per week, but talking about them more. But if you really like having many more and I keep it shorter, let me know. But I really, enjoyed last week's and this week's. I think it's less stressful for me, and it allows me to go through themes better, because you saw there were a lot of themes that coalesced in the final 2 questions here. So I do try to group them in certain ways. Like, I don't only just get these questions and write answers and then figure out what I'm going to say in the YouTube video, but I'm also figuring out what order to put everything in. That's a big part of this as well, believe it or not. But anyway, if you're still here and you've been here since the beginning of the video, I will ask that you subscribe at this point if you haven't already. I think at this point you kind of have to. I think morally you have to subscribe, right? I'm saying this tongue very firmly planted in cheek. I'm half joking, but I think you should subscribe. We're very close to 2,000. By the time this video goes out to the masses, I think we will be at 2,000, and some exciting things are going to happen. We're going to be upgrading a few things here as well. I'm going to get a green screen, for example, so that I could be sitting in like the prancing pony or whatever. I think that would be fun. Anyway, guys, send me your questions, of course. Consider membership if you want to support me in that way. If you don't, that's just fine. Just watching the videos helps me out as well. Subscribing helps me. Sharing the videos helps me. Leaving comments helps me. Even if you don't have something to say, even if you just want to say nice video or just say hi or whatever, if you want to say, "and my axe," or say some line from The Lord of the Rings, whether it's the book or the movie or whatever, leave a comment, because that really helps feed the algorithm and make sure that the video gets shown to more people, because YouTube really doesn't show the videos to all the subscribers. So it's just the way it goes. Unfortunately, that's the way YouTube works. I will see you guys next time.